What's going on, guys? Sunglasses are back. I actually got a new pair recently. I haven't done this in like 7 or 8 months. This is called Throwback Tuesdays, where on Tuesdays I talk about a topic or do a top 10 or anything, any kind of music related topic from the past. Um, so, this episode of Throwback Tuesdays, I'm going to talk about thrash metal. I'm gonna get into stuff like what influenced thrash metal, what thrash metal influenced, the story of thrash metal, and my top 10 thrash metal albums of all time. That'll also be in there. So, just gonna jump into things here and talk about the genesis of thrash metal, or the beginning. Um, I guess you can say thrash metal was really influenced by the new wave of British heavy metal. In the late 70s and early 80s, bands from England like I think Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Motorhead, Diamond Head, Thin Lizzy, even Def Leppard in the early days. They started to get some attention, not just in England, in America as well. Well, more than just some attention. They were actually starting to get pretty fucking big. And eventually, bands like Metallica in the early 80s, when they were starting out, they used the style that these types of bands had, but with their own twist. They kind of created a faster, little more aggressive and unique, but often similar sound, thus eventually starting the wave of thrash metal. In fact, Metallica takes a lot of their early music off the sound that Diamond Head produced. Songs like "Am I Evil" really, oh, man. Songs like "Am I Evil" really show that. Actually, I think Metallica performs "Am I Evil" in live concerts from time to time. Um, so before I continue the story of thrash metal, let's do my top 10 thrash metal albums of all time. Number 10, I'm gonna have to go with Megadeth's album Rust in Peace. I'm not heavily into Megadeth. I like Megadeth. They're not like my absolute favorite, but I do like them. And Rust in Peace would have to be one of my favorites that they put out. It's really got that exciting thrash metal feel. It's the first album to feature that drummer, what's his name, Nick Menza, I think. I think it was him on the album. Great guitar work by Friedman. Again, in my opinion, it's one of their best albums. Peace Sells is pretty good too, but I really like this album. Sweet guitar solos all throughout the album. It's honestly, in a nutshell, this album is everything you want in a thrash metal album, with some extras added, and much more, if you want to say that. Number 9, I'm gonna have to go with Exodus, Bounded by Blood. Probably one of the albums that helped bring in the new wave of thrash metal. One of the earliest thrash metal albums. I'm not going to say the earliest, but it's definitely an essential for getting into thrash metal. This album is heavily dependent on speed and aggression. It's probably one of the most aggressive thrash metal albums out there. When it comes to intensity, honestly, if there was an intensity level, it would be 100%. It's a very intense album. The guitar riffs are obviously aggressive, but at times can get melodic, which is pretty cool. But you definitely hear them at their best when the speed is at a fast pace. Once again, it's an essential if you're getting into early thrash. Number 8, I'm going to have to go with Hell Awaits by Slayer. Super, super underrated album. People often forget about this album in general when they think of Slayer. A lot of the generic fans that don't know much about Slayer will say that Rain and Blood was their first album, but it's not true. They actually put 2 albums out before that are not really that recognized. But this album is actually really, really good. It's got more complex musical structure than their first album, Show No Mercy, which had more of a new wave of British heavy metal kind of influence to it. This album kind of shifts away from that a bit. It's a little more dark and often terrifying, which is good. I will say it's not recorded in the best quality, and there are moments where Tom Araya is just trying to fit too many words into a verse, but it gives the album more of a raw feel to it, I guess. But once again, it's an incredibly underrated Slayer album, and if you're a Slayer fan and you haven't heard this album, you gotta listen to it, man. You gotta know their roots. Number 7. What should I pick for number 7? I'm gonna go with Darkest Descents by Dark Angel, another underrated thrash metal album. It's honestly just as good as Slayer's first 2 albums. It's got lots of speed. Can't stress that enough. The album is heavily reliant on speed. But it's stuff you can headbang to, you know, it's cut to the chase, raw, aggressive, evil, and often psychotic. It's an essential. Dark Angel's pretty good. Number 6, I'm going to have to go with Slayer again, with South of Heaven. Now, this album was the follow-up to their album Rain and Blood, which, like Hell Awaits, relied on speed and aggression. However, when Slayer did this album, they really decided to take things into a new direction, and kind of slow the music down a bit and go for a harder and heavier kind of feel, which was definitely unpredictable for Slayer to do so. But honestly, it really worked. You know, it took you back to the dark, sinister, evil side of Slayer. The album does have some catchy riffs and songs that I consider some of my favorite Slayer songs, such as the song itself, South of Heaven. The intro to that song really shows the impact that this new path that Slayer has taken. That intro is just super dark and unsettling in a cool way. Behind the Crooked Cross is a really good song, man. It's really showed that hard, heavy, and catchy riffs in the guitar that they were going for. A couple songs in the album are kind of stale, but all in all, it's a fantastic album. Number 5, I'm obviously going to have to go with Ride the Lightning by Metallica. This is an album I will cherish forever. It's one of the first Metallica albums that I ever heard growing up as a kid. This album had some well-known songs such as Fade to Black and For Whom the Bell Tolls, but some underrated and overlooked songs as well, like what was one? Fight Fire with Fire, Call of Cthulhu, Trapped Under Ice was pretty good too. But this album really showed Metallica at their thrashiest. Most songs on this album just take you down that aggressive, fast-paced thrash feel. But every now and then, they do slow things down a bit and go all melodic and even emotional, and even dark. But you really feel this album at times. You know, well, you feel the album all the time. I mean, when it's aggressive, you feel it. You feel the rush. When it gets melodic, you feel the emotion. You know, honestly, Metallica did an amazing job with this album. It's one of their best, in my opinion. Number 4. Number 4 would have to be Seven Churches by Possessed. Now, this album does get overlooked from time to time, but it's still recognized as one of the essentials, not just in thrash metal, but metal in general. It's honestly right up there with Metallica's Kill 'Em All album and Slayer's first 2 albums. It's fantastic. It is thrash, but it's a little unique and often quite intense for thrash metal. But it does give you that typical thrash metal. Well, I meant to say it doesn't give you that typical thrash metal expectation. It goes outside of the box, to be honest. The album is just frantic and technical. There's no smoothness or slow progression in any song whatsoever. Like, the transitions are just abrupt and pretty fast. Once again, it's an essential. It's pretty good. It does go outside of the box. Number three, I'm gonna have to go with Slayer's Seasons in the Abyss. Now, this album was really Slayer at their absolute peak. Some of their best work is on this album. Songs like War Ensemble are exciting, fast-paced, and intense, even a bit progressive, but not as hard and heavy as South of Heaven. But again, more fast-paced and aggressive, much like Rain and Blood and Hell Awaits, but not as repetitive. There's a lot of change and progression in most of the songs, and there are even some mid-paced tracks on here, so I can't really say the album's fully reliant on speed. But honestly, this album's fucking awesome, man. If you're a Slayer fan, this is the album to go with if you want that perfect Slayer sound. Number two, obviously, is going to have to be Metallica's And Justice for All, my favorite Metallica album. This is Metallica at their absolute best. This was them at their peak. They really gave it their all with this album. I mean, you had her early thrash influences mixed with some progressive storytelling. You had longer songs than usual, and even some darker, more doom metal-like influences in the mix here and there, which I really wish Metallica went more towards that direction after this album. You had multiple guitar riffs in one song. Each song had multiple guitar riffs. Lars's drumming was pretty good for Lars. I mean, you wouldn't even think it's Lars on the drums. It's him at his 100% best, even more than that. James' vocals were obviously pretty good. I mean, everything was just fucking amazing. I mean, the Black Album was a pretty disappointing follow-up to this album. And number one would have to be Testament, The New Order. Once again, often overlooked but recognized as one of the best thrash metal albums of all time. This album's it is my favorite thrash metal album ever. I mean, Testament is wicked. They are underrated, and this album got me hyped up. The first time I heard the song Into the Pit, I got that rush and that excitement and that feeling fucking metal, man. This album to me is what defines thrash metal. It's a perfect combination of intensity, speed, aggression, and melody. It's a great album. But yeah, those were my top 10 thrash metal albums, or my favorite thrash metal albums. But yeah, when people talk about thrash metal, they mostly talk about the big four, which is Metallica, Anthrax, Slayer, and Megadeth. And the big four are obviously fantastic, but the generic fans who aren't really heavily into thrash often overlook the other bands that were making thrash metal at the time. And they were just as good. Bands like Testament, Exodus, Creator, Dark Angel. I mentioned some of these guys earlier. Overkill, Annihilator, and Nuclear Assault. I mean, I could go on. But these bands all put out some fantastic albums during the wave of thrash metal. Some I may have mentioned earlier, but some I didn't mention were Testament, for example. They had another album called The Legacy, which is also one of my favorites. Alice in Hell by Annihilator was pretty good. Time Does Not Heal by Dark Angel. Kind of more towards the end of thrash, but pretty good album as well. Handle with Care by Nuclear Assault is obviously another great one. There's so many of them. I strongly recommend thrash fans who haven't really dived into the bands outside of the big four. Check some of that stuff out. It's just as good, honestly. Now, in the early 90s, we saw thrash metal kind of fading away. I mean, Metallica put out the Black Album, and to be honest, they were never really the same after that, at least not until recently. Slayer kind of died down a bit after Divine Intervention. Other bands were looking to evolve and change their sound, and, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you can't not have musical evolution. Eventually you get to a point where, okay, this album can't really sound the same as the last few. Um, and honestly, in the early 90s, as thrash was dying, we saw the rise of death metal and black metal. We had bands like Morbid Angel, Gutted, Cannibal Corpse, Death, Carcass, Mayhem, Darkthrone. Again, I could go on, but thrash metal kind of helped influence death metal. The raw and intensity and aggression in thrash metal kind of carried on into death metal a bit. Listen to some of the early 90s death metal albums, and you'll definitely get a thrashy kind of vibe. Now, death metal obviously wasn't fully influenced by thrash metal. Bands like Death have been around since the 80s. But there is, towards the 90s, there was more of a thrash influence added into the mix in a lot of the records. Black metal wasn't, it didn't really take too much from thrash metal. Black metal was kind of, black metal came from bands like Venom and Bathory and those guys. But here and there, I guess you can say, you do hear a little bit of thrash influence. Not a lot, though. But yeah, in the early 90s, then you had those pure against the grain heavy metal bands or groove metal bands like Pantera. That definitely, I mean, they had the classic metal influences like Black Sabbath and those guys, but they were definitely influenced by bands like Slayer, who used, like bands like Pantera used the aggression of thrash metal and created groovier and heavier, a lot slower music. Thrash was definitely a seed that grew into more subgenres of metal, and it was truly a landmark in the history of metal. I mean, you can't tell the story of metal without thrash. And honestly, like a lot of those thrash bands are still pretty big today. Metallica obviously is still selling out arenas. Slayer, same thing. You know, they're still putting out albums and stuff. So I can't really say the thrash bands are dead. It's just that era of thrash metal is no longer. And I wish I could have grown up during that era, but I grew up with all the music. So, thank you guys so much for sitting through the story of thrash metal and my favorite thrash metal albums, and hope you guys enjoyed the resurrection of Throwback Tuesdays. Thank you guys for watching.